I know it's just the middle of the summer, but we've already got to start thinking about what we're going to do for fall seeding. So if you're going to put in some winter wheat this fall, for example, what do you need to do to get that field ready? Whether it's corn like what we have behind us, maybe it's fallow ground, maybe it was wheat that was harvested earlier this year. We want to talk through all these things and look at what's most important to focus on today.
Well, it seems a little early, Brian, but of course you're the planner, so we've got to get all ready for this stuff. Now, when we're talking about this, we're looking at weed control. One of the things in our part of the country that gets asked a lot is manure. How early can I put manure out? Because if a guy's got a lagoon or a pit that's really starting to get full, he says, wow, I've got a few wheat acres. Could I be using those acres early in the season to get some manure out there?
First of all, we want you to go out and do some soil testing. So let's answer Darren's question though. In terms of manure, I would say it's too early to be putting any manure out unless you absolutely have to. So yes, if your pit is plumb full, go ahead and get some manure out there, that's fine. But the trouble with the manure and putting it out now is you're going to lose some of that nitrogen. I get very concerned about that this early in the season when it's still this warm. So if it was me, I'd like to wait until close to planting time before I would put that manure on.
Well, one thing there that I liked, Brian, is you said soil testing, and I think that's real important. You say, well, you know, I've got some wheat acres, but I've also got a few other crops, but right now the wheat is out. I can get out on that ground and I can get my soil testing done, and I would strongly advise that. See what's left. Maybe you were in an area that got a little bit of extra rain this year and you had more yield than what you were planning for. I talked to a number of guys who maybe fertilized for 60 bushel wheat, but they ended up with 90 bushel wheat. Well, there aren't going to be a whole lot of nutrients left in a field if you applied fertilizer for a 60 bushel crop and took 90 bushels away. So you do need to do some soil testing out there to find out what's going on.
Okay, but here's the problem with the soil testing. Typically, when we're talking about wheat soil testing, we're dealing with great big fields and guys who don't do a whole lot of soil testing. What we would strongly advise you to do, you don't have to do grid sampling like they might do in Iowa or Illinois, but what we would suggest is at least zone sampling. So in other words, sample different soil types separately and sample different topographies separately. So in other words, do the hilltops totally separate from the side hills, totally separate from the valleys. As long as you do that, then you're going to have a much better idea of what's really going on in the field. And here's one of the reasons why it's so important to do that. Because soil pH can vary dramatically from the hills down to the valleys. And soil pH is the number one thing you always want to take a look at on a soil test. For example, ideally we'd like to have about a 6.8 for a soil pH. If your soil pH is up to 8, or maybe it's down to 5.5, you, chances are giving up 25% of your wheat yield, maybe even more. That's an awful lot based on just one soil characteristic. So if we can fix that soil pH, then all of a sudden you're going to get a lot more wheat yield, and it really didn't cost you that much and really didn't take all that much effort to fix.
Well, soil pH certainly is important, but one thing that I see that's also important in fields, especially in small grain fields, is micronutrients. When you're doing your soil test, make sure you're getting a complete soil test that's going to tell you about some of the other things besides your N, P, and K.
You're most likely going to have some that are high, some that are low. You say, oh boy, I have no idea what I'm doing here. Here's what I'd recommend. This is what we do on our own farm. When I see that I'm short on some micronutrients, I apply all the micronutrients because it doesn't take very much. It's real easy to get micronutrients out of balance. What I try to do is find a blended product that's got the right ratio for wheat, and then when I can fertilize with that across the whole field, it's easy for me to get all the micronutrients into certain plants.
Another nutrient that doesn't get mentioned enough is sulfur. A wheat crop actually will remove 10 to 15 pounds of sulfur per acre. It's a big deal. You say, well, 10 or 15 pounds, that's nothing I need to worry about. But sulfur is one of those nutrients that makes other nutrients work, like nitrogen, for example. By applying the proper amount of sulfur, your plant actually becomes more efficient with its nitrogen use. So every time we're applying nitrogen to a crop, typically every 10 to 15 pounds of nitrogen we're applying, we're also adding a pound of sulfur. So unless we have a volcanic eruption where there's tons of sulfur coming out, chances are you're going to need to be applying sulfur on your farm.
Well, nutrients are really important, and we're discussing this today because we want you to get ready for this fall's wheat crop. The other thing you've got to make sure you're doing at this time of year is controlling weeds, especially if you've got a fallow situation or if you've already harvested the wheat crop. And this is especially important if you're going wheat on wheat. You've got to make sure you eliminate the green bridge. In other words, make sure that everything in that field is dead for at least a couple of weeks prior to seeding your fall wheat crop in order to do the very best job for disease control and even insects to some degree. The reason why it's so important to get all these things taken care of now is once that crop gets started in the fall, it's a lot tougher to kill the bugs and the diseases and the weeds. Get it taken care of right now if you can.
So getting the nutrients under control, doing good soil testing so you can apply the right nutrients for your crop, and keeping those weeds out of there, especially a couple of weeks leading up to planting, but really throughout the whole summer if possible, is very important if you want to have a successful winter wheat crop.
Well, speaking of weeds, can you identify this week's weed? We'll talk about it coming up next.